Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. at the conclusion of a great event about Dick Nelson's new book on General Andrew Goodpaster, one of the great giants in American national security. He was a senior advisor to President Eisenhower, a highly decorated soldier who also served as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe at a very, very critical time in the alliance. And we have with us Bob Sorley, who is a 1956 graduate of the United States Military Academy, a retired lieutenant colonel, spent a life as a, I think I can say this, as a soldier scholar in your own right, who also had a distinguished career at the Central Intelligence Agency. And you're also the author of the 1999 critically well-received book, A Better War, that affected President Obama and his senior staff in terms of looking at the surge strategy for Afghanistan. I want to start off, you've been a student, you were a friend of General Goodpaster's, obviously one of the folks who spurred Dick to write this biography of General Goodpaster, and I was honored to know him when I was a young reporter. Talk to us a little bit about what you think are the key lessons from this man that are applicable in this security environment, which in so many ways is similar to the chaotic environment that he faced at the height of the Cold War.
Great question to start with. And the first thing I have to say about General Goodpaster is his enormous influence and his influence for good stemmed from the kind of man he was. He had a sterling character. He was personally modest. His strong intellect, a commitment to public service, physical and intellectual courage. I mean, this is a checklist of things you'd like to have in public servants here or any place. And then he had the great good fortune to have places that he could bring all those qualities to bear where it mattered. And that went back to his earliest days. In World War II, he was a combat engineer, but he was involved in, his unit was involved in some of the bloodiest battles of the war, the struggles for Monte Cassino in Italy, and he won the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts. His unit won a Distinguished Presidential Unit Citation. So from early days, he's in the thick of things where it counts, and he's able to bring good things to pass because of those qualities that he had. That's the kind of man he was. So why does that make it important to us? I more than any other reason, because that's the kind of guy we should want to be. And we can't all be that to the degree that he was, but we can all try.
One of the points that you made is that General Goodpaster used to, and I should note that General Goodpaster was also a former chairman of the Atlantic Council, where we are today. But Bob, one of the points you made was that General Goodpaster always reminded everybody, remember the big picture. Think about not just your role in the narrow thing you're doing, but how your narrow thing actually fits into the bigger puzzle.
Yeah, and you have to hope that the bigger thing succeeds as well, because if it does not, what you do with your smaller piece may not matter that much. Goodpaster was very good about that, and that's especially important in military affairs, where the larger affair is the outcome of the conflict. I told an anecdote during the conference about a visitor to the Steinway piano factory in New York, and at one stop there's a little old lady, gray-haired, and she's putting strings on a piano, and the visitor says, "Good afternoon, madam, what are you doing?" And she draws herself up to her full 5'3" or whatever she is, and she says, "I'm building Steinway grand pianos." She had the big picture, and that was a wonderful example of just what you asked about.
Let me ask you from a strategy standpoint. I mean, at the point that General Goodpaster, a 1939 West Point grad, which you noted he was second in his class. So not only was he, and it's really extraordinary, though, when you think of his career on all the jobs that he did, but you also said his combat pedigree, but he was also one of the first PhDs to graduate from Princeton, which is something that sort of blazing a trail for generations of officers, whether they were David Petraeus's or Jim Stavridis's, who had advanced degrees in strategy. But one of the things I want to ask you is, that was a very, very challenging security environment. And you have done more than many in studying all of these different phases of American national security. What are some of the lessons that you've learned and drawn, and also some personal experiences that should shape how we look at today's very, very chaotic security situation?
Well, that's a great question. We could talk about it for the rest of the day. One of the things that comes to mind as a start toward an answer is to look at it as General Goodpaster did, as certainly as Eisenhower did, as Marshall did, in the largest possible context. What happens in the rest of the world has enormous impact on our security, our economic well-being, our quality of life, and they all understood that. And of course, the creation of NATO was a stem from that understanding and that belief. General Goodpaster's influence was in part because he was able to look at any issue or problem, and there were plenty of them on his watch, and place it into a larger context. And I think he was a very good strategist in the sense that he was able to balance a short-term and longer-term interests and effects. He was able to contemplate what a lot of people cannot do, second and third order consequences of things that look good on the, at first blush, maybe had negative consequences otherwise. So that's, that's what a strategist usually tries to do. People said, and Dick Nelson brings this point out very well in his book, people said that when Goodpaster confronted a problem, instead of trying to narrow it, he tried to put it in a larger context so he could understand more fully the implications of whatever solution he came up with.
We're obviously into a great power era again. Obviously, China is flexing its muscles and economic power, growing military power, has our allies on edge. Obviously, the Obama administration launched the Pacific Pivot to reassure some of our allies who were concerned about that, our attention obviously having been focused on Iraq and in Afghanistan. If you look at Russia, Russia has been rising, invasion of Ukraine, and now we're in a great power dynamic, obviously, or have been with Russia as well, that's seeking to undermine our allies, very much as was the case during the Cold War, of sort of constantly trying to undermine the Atlantic Alliance with some success now. What do you think are the keys, both as a practitioner of national security, as you long were, but also a student of American power? What are the best ways to leverage American power in these coming years?
Yeah, another fine question. There are probably two or three really key things. The first, I think, is to have a clear vision of what it is you seek to accomplish. The second is to do everything possible to rally a consensus among the American people that that's worth doing. And usually there's some sacrifices involved, so that's worth making those sacrifices. And the third is probably to look at the world abroad and engage as many nations as you can as allies or willing collaborators or even military partners if that's what's required. If you have all three of those things going for you, the odds of the two good things happen, it seems to me. One is the odds of success in whatever it is you've said you're going to try to achieve go up dramatically. And the second is the likelihood of being able to achieve that without a resort to military force is also increased. So those would be the most important, I think.
How would you respond, and how do you think General Goodpaster would have responded, or even President Eisenhower would have responded? Everything that an American president has done, rightly or wrongly, has been to put America first, but rarely say that specifically as a slogan. And there is a concern by some, especially in terms of the new president's view of international organizations and not being entangled in that, which seems very antithetical to what American strategy has been since its inception in the post-World War II era. What are the potential implications and the potential possible dangers of that from your standpoint?
It may be a matter of semantics because public servants of any nation are obliged to look first to the interests of their own nation. They're elected, or however they come to power, for that very purpose. So then the next question becomes, well, how are those interests best served? My perspective, and I don't know how broadly this is shared now, my perspective is that the best interests of America are shared by looking at the global best interests as well as our own. That if we're better off living in a world where prosperity is widespread, where tensions and hostilities are muted or reduced, where nations work together cooperatively in trade and culturally as well. And so if you say that's what's meant by putting America first, I'm all for it. America has historically been a very generous nation. How many other countries have, start just with treasure, have given the colossal amounts of foreign aid that we've given to other nations around the world? You can argue that we've done that out of self-interest, and I say fine, because if helping others to be stronger and more prosperous is in our interest, then let us do it. What's wrong with that? So I'm hoping that putting America first in the current and immediate future years is going to mean, among other things, continuation of American generosity and friendship for all of those who will be friends with us.
If, however, as some suspect, and as the President has said, that there should be an American withdrawal from these international organizations that the United States helped create, whether it's NATO. America was key, and President Eisenhower was key, as was President Truman, in the start of the European Economic Community that then built into the European Union, obviously to bind warring and squabbling nations together in an economic construct that would prevent crisis and conflict. There's now a danger that as the EU dissolves, nations will go back to perhaps negative trends in terms of their relationships. What do you think are the potential implications of a world in which the United States is not acting as that leader that looks beyond its pure interest to a global strategic interest?
So you should be answering these questions instead of me. I can see that you understand the implications very well.
I've studied it, sir. You've practiced it.
Yeah. The short and long-term outlooks are not always the same. I liked that you put the emphasis on, of the major alliances, especially NATO, of binding together those who have joined in that enterprise, whereas for decades, centuries past, they have often been at one another's throats. That can only be to their interest. Even if that's all NATO accomplished, that would be extraordinarily important, I think. The other thing that you have to say, though, is this is an old quip among soldiers, you know, the enemy gets a vote. So what happens in the rest of the world, especially, of course, Russia and China, has a lot to do with what we can accomplish and what we need to accomplish, or what we can step away from. My whole lifetime has been bound up with a united Western Europe as a force for good, as a force for peace. It would be very sad to me personally if that were to erode, but I can't predict the future.
What do you think some of the things that the United States can do and Western governments can do at a time when these fundamental institutions, as well as the electoral futures, I mean, you know, if you look at it, the right-wing movements, extreme right-wing movements look like they've got a good shot in France, they've got a good shot in the Netherlands, they're growing in Germany, for example. Austria, obviously, decided against that outcome. But in each of these countries, there are powerful voices that are seeking the dissolution, for example, of the European Union. Britain has taken a key step in that fashion, emboldening some of these movements. Indeed, there are some say that it was the Brexit, Theresa May's outcome that helped Donald Trump and propelled him or gave him a certain impetus here to become a leader of what is, by some, and I think one of Trump's senior-most advisors, Steve Bannon, a global populist movement to change the status quo. What do you think the best way to counter some of these anti-international narratives that have grown over the past several years?
You're getting a simple soldier pretty far out of his comfort zone here. I will say this. I think that the perceived, and maybe you could say belatedly perceived, necessity to deal with the new threats of non-state actors, especially global terrorism, has precipitated some of that movement across the political spectrum. And so if you're concerned about that, then I would say one of the ways to try to deal with that is to come to grips with that threat and find ways to deal with it that do not require us to compromise our core values. The issue that concerns me most at the moment that falls within that category is the idea that we should countenance the use of torture on the part of our military and intelligence figures. I wrote to the President 3 days ago about that and stated that I was irrevocably and totally opposed to that. And that was whether it, quote, worked or not, because the use of torture is debasing and humiliating to those who practice it. And our people should not be encouraged or required to do that. So, in this case, maybe you have to disaggregate the problem and try to deal with individual pieces of it, probably some more successful than others. We don't know how this is going to play out. It's a little like teaching cadets at West Point. You don't know how well you've done your job until 20 or 30 years later. We'll see how those classes play out. The class that General Goodpaster was a part of came onto the scene in 1939. For us on the threshold of a global war, turned out extraordinarily well. We can only hope we've done half as well with those that come along now.
I wanted to, one of the things which you said was amazing was that you actually knew a Captain Brent Scowcroft, yes, who was also a product of West Point. Yes. So what was Captain Scowcroft like? Because some of us know Lieutenant General Scowcroft.
Yes. Well, I also have the privilege of knowing Lieutenant General Scowcroft, and as everyone in that room today joined in telling him we have extraordinarily high regard for him. But Captain Scowcroft in the section room at West Point, West Point since the days of Sylvanus Thayer has prided itself on small classes, no more than 15 or 16 in a classroom. So there we are, young cadets with this brilliant young Air Force captain, full of juice, full of beans, charming man, and from our perspective at least, fully informed on every matter that could possibly come up in class. He was an example of why the service academies, West Point in particular, want to have the bulk of their faculty be young serving officers who are there on detail, typically for 3 or 4 years, because they are not only imparting knowledge of the subject matter at hand, but they're showing us what young officers could and should be like, and they're showing us a path that we might follow. And many of us did then, as young captains ourselves, go back and spend 3 years, let us say, teaching, and then go on to our new assignment. But Brent Scowcroft, you could tell then, we're young cadets, we can tell this is a superstar, and he's going to go a long way, and we were not wrong in that.
Let me ask you one last question, sir. You are a scholar. You went out of your way to mention General Goodpaster's history and specifically point out that at that time it was very rare for a general officer to have gotten a PhD, for example, mm-hmm. as General Goodpaster did from Princeton, and a number of other advanced degrees that he had. Do you think the educational system for officers? I know that you remain still engaged with West Point, but is the educational process the right process we need to grow the kind of strategic leaders we need for the future as we've had in the past?
Yeah, I think it is. I think what we say, the broadening of education that one gets by beginning at West Point but then going to civilian graduate schools is very important. I had good luck in that respect. I went first to Penn and got a master's degree in literature and went back and taught English at West Point. Later, when I was at the Army War College, I went to Penn State and got a public administration degree, another master's degree. And then I went to Hopkins and got a PhD in national security policy. So for me, I felt I was extraordinarily fortunate in all of that. The problem I have these days, and I can't tell you exactly where I would lay most of the blame because it's complicated and it's not one place only, is that a large percentage of the graduates from the military academy are leaving the service at the end of their obligated terms of service. My class served, 3/4 of us served to a full career until we're retirement or killed in combat or some other thing before that. And I wish I knew how to fix that because we're losing a lot of talent that we should be retaining, and that's not all their fault. It's got to be partly our fault too, and I'm concerned that the parts of the military establishment that need to be concerned about that and deal with it don't seem to be taking that as seriously as I wish they would. I hate to end on a negative note, but that's my take on what you asked me.
I'm going to try to end it on a positive take. You mentioned that when you were at the United States Military Academy, Army 1, Navy 1, Army 1, Navy 1. I think that you were enthusiastic about the outcome last year when Army won. How does that relationship have to look as far as you're concerned? Navy did have it for a couple of years. It looks like Army's got a very, very fine squad. What do you take away as the rival, as somebody who's enjoyed that rivalry for as long as you have now?
Well, I will say I was only moderately happy this year because, unfortunately for Navy, their 2 co-captains and their top quarterback were all unable to play in that game, and that was too bad. I would like to see both teams at full strength and then, battle it out. I do think it was good when we were cadets in that the winning and the losing was fairly evenly distributed, and why that hasn't all continued, I don't know. The good thing about sports is the team building aspect of it, I think. I like sports a lot. At West Point, I was not a core squad athlete. That means that's what they call the varsity athletes there. But every cadet played intramural sports every season, 3 seasons a year, all 4 years. So you play 12 sports, unless in your senior years you get to go back and be a coach or an official in a sport you've already played. Well, first of all, that was an awful lot of fun. Secondly, there is the team building and the leadership aspects of sport. So I would like to see more emphasis on that and not so much worried about being one of the top intercollegiate teams because, quite frankly, with the advent of the National Football League and all of that, the Army is never going to attract top-level athletes again in major sports like football and basketball, nor should they. And but the athletic program that every cadet takes part in every season, that's good stuff. I'm all for that.
And I thought it was great that you said that every true West Pointer is always rooting for Navy except for one day out of the year.
That's exactly right. And we're going to go to war with them, and we want to support them every time we can. Only one time we can't support them, and that's when it's head-to-head.
Bob, thanks so very much for spending so much time with us. Really enjoyed the conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.